Hello everyone and welcome to Eye on Africa on this Thursday. As the year draws to a close, we've decided to do things a little bit differently. Today and tomorrow we will be looking back at what has been a tumultuous year for many of us and looking ahead at what we can expect in 2021. Here are some of the stories we'll be covering in tonight's edition. We will, of course, be looking back at the coronavirus pandemic, which has swept across Africa, how countries reacted differently, and how the catastrophe feared by health authorities failed to materialize. We will speak to our correspondent in Ethiopia about the war in the Tigray, which killed thousands of people, and the difficulties of reporting on the conflict. And what about the tens of thousands who now live in refugee camps in Sudan? And 2020 was also a year of political change for many African countries. We'll speak to our contributor Douglas Yates about those shifts and what we can expect next year. But first, it's been a year that none of us will forget anytime soon. A year which saw a handful of pneumonia-like cases in China explode into a worldwide and deadly pandemic. Across Africa, governments scrambled to protect their citizens, ordering lockdowns and curfews and shutting borders. But while health authorities in March had feared a health disaster in the continent, it appears Africa has so far escaped the worst of the coronavirus. Laurent Bersecher has more.
February 14, 2020, Egypt confirmed the African continent's first case of coronavirus. This sent health authorities scrambling to prevent the pandemic from getting out of control. With only a few intensive care units scattered across the continent, Africa's focus quickly turned to prevention and early intervention. By the end of February, the continent was taking preventive measures far beyond what was being done in Europe, with varying degrees of success. One of the quickest countries to act, Rwanda fully closed its borders and suspended all international flights in March. It also introduced mass testing of the population, as it vowed to identify every single case of COVID-19. The country remains hailed as an African success story for the way it managed to curb the spread of the virus. By contrast, in neighboring Burundi, authorities did not take COVID-19 seriously. Then President Pierre Nkurunziza said the country was protected by God and failed to impose any lockdown or social distancing measures, even expelling World Health Organization staff from the country in May. According to official figures, COVID cases remain relatively low in Burundi, yet many experts say authorities there have been covering up the scale of the pandemic. Despite implementing one of the world's strictest lockdowns in March, South Africa was the African country hardest hit by the virus. But while its 24,000 COVID-related deaths account for more than half of the entire continent's, it has so far managed to avoid the worst-case scenario of the virus decimating overcrowded townships. Analysts have credited Africa's relative success in tackling the COVID-19 pandemic on several factors, including a younger population and a warmer climate, but also on the continent's rapid response, which drew on a rich experience of combating infectious diseases such as Ebola and HIV.
On November 4th, members of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, attacked Ethiopian defense forces in the Tigrayan capital of Mekele. In retaliation, Ethiopian forces launched a major offensive, which included a shutdown of government services and infrastructure in the region. Thousands of people were likely killed in the ensuing violence, with tens of thousands more forced to flee the region and make their way into Sudan. France 24's Maria Gert-Nicolescu is our correspondent in Addis Ababa and has been covering the conflict since the beginning. She has more on the challenges of covering the war and the latest on the humanitarian situation.
What's important to bear in mind is that from the first day of the conflict, which erupted early November, telecommunications were entirely shut down throughout the Tigray region. So it's been very difficult for journalists and for anyone actually to know exactly what was going on the ground. And this is true up until today. So of course we tried to go to the Tigray region to see for ourselves. About 1 week after the conflict started, I traveled to the Amhara region near the border with Tigray, and we were even able to drive up until the city of Dansha in the Tigray region. But but we were not allowed to get out of our cars, and we were summoned to return to Addis Ababa shortly after that. So ever since then, we've been reporting from here, from the capital, trying to balance declarations made by the government with declarations made by the leaders of the TPLF, who were not always reachable, with very few additional sources of information, and information, of course, always very difficult to verify. Now, communications were restored in some parts of the Tigray region, around the western areas and around the regional capital Mekelle, and very few journalists were allowed to the western and southern areas, but this is not enough to fully understand whether clashes are continuing, and if yes, where, and to fully grasp the extent of the damage, which could include possible war crimes which could have been carried out by all sides to the conflict. One of the only direct sources of information that journalists have had access to have been the Ethiopian refugees in Sudan. There are over 50,000 Ethiopians who've crossed the border to Sudan since the conflict started. Organizations are saying that about half of these people are children. They are mostly Tigrayans, because Tigrayans make up the majority of the population in the Tigray region, and living conditions on the Sudanese side of the border are extremely harsh, with very limited means to help these refugees. Now, there are fewer Ethiopians crossing into Sudan on a daily basis now. There's been clashes reported between the Sudanese army and Ethiopian armed groups near the border. There's also been reports of Ethiopian armed groups preventing refugees from crossing into Sudan. So it might well be that it's becoming increasingly difficult for Ethiopians to reach Sudan. And organizations are saying that these 50,000 refugees are only the tip of the iceberg, with a much larger scale of displacement having likely occurred within Tigray itself. Some estimates go up to 1 million internally displaced people. There's a full-scale humanitarian crisis unfolding in the region. Already about 600,000 people were relying on aid even before the conflict started, and the UN is now saying that an additional 1 million people could require humanitarian assistance, with UNICEF warning that over 2 million children are at risk. There's been extremely limited access for humanitarian organizations to Tigray, and these organizations are now very worried about what they will find once things open up again.
Throughout the year, hundreds of people have lost their lives in terror attacks committed by Boko Haram. The terrorist group has refused to ease its deadly insurgency in Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, and Niger. France 24's Sam Olukoya talks about the logistical difficulties of covering attacks in the region and the emotional toll that remains long after the atrocities are over.
In November, Boko Haram fighters killed scores of farmers and abducted many others in Borno State. Then in December, Boko Haram claimed responsibility for the abduction of 333 students from a secondary school in Katsina State. It's been difficult covering Boko Haram. One, because it's so dangerous to go to areas where Boko Haram operate. Secondly, transporters are quite reluctant to go to these areas because they know it's very dangerous. The military also has placed a lot of travel restrictions in areas where Boko Haram operate. One of the best ways to cover Boko Haram has been through telephone. But even then, telephone has its own limitation. Sometimes you cannot reach people because telephone network has gone down because Boko Haram has destroyed telecommunication facilities. But sometimes have been able to visit people, speak to eyewitness one-on-one to know the impact of Boko Haram atrocities on them. One remarkable case was the case of a student who was abducted and kept by Boko Haram. I met the family, and they told me that one day they woke up and saw videos of their son being executed. The striking thing was that this young man was executed by a boy who is about 10 years old. It was quite striking to me that a boy of this age could carry out this kind of atrocity. And I could not help thinking that what future lies for a boy of 10 who was given a gun to kill?
Several African countries held elections this year, from Cameroon's parliamentary vote in February to the Ivory Coast's presidential race in October. 2020 has been a year of change for some and continuity for others. Let's bring in our contributor Douglas Yates. He is a political scientist and a professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. Douglas, thank you for being with us. When we talked on the phone to prepare this show, you told me how surprised you'd been with the trend in authoritarianism that some countries have seen this year.
Right. In addition to the normal authoritarian rulers like Uganda's Yoweri Museveni, there's new actors who used to be opposition leaders who seem to have become authoritarian rulers. For example, Alassane Ouattara of Ivory Coast was a long-time opposition leader and who's now become a president for life. And the same in Alpha Condé for Guinea, who had been a long-time opposition leader, had even been in prison. And now, with his victory in the most recent elections, seems cued to become an authoritarian ruler, corrupt. There's rulers of Tanzania with all but the end of rule of law, banning opposition leaders, John Magufuli and Abiy Ahmed, the Nobel Prize winner, for peace, who might now be waging civil war. There is Emerson Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe, who had ousted Robert Mugabe, and former security leader, seems to be on the path to authoritarianism. Edgar Lungu in Zambia. So there's a lot of rulers, including former opposition leaders, who seem to be on the bad path.
On the other hand, though, the several countries across the continent have seen a stable democratic process take hold.
Yeah. Ghana, for example, although there is now a contested election result, we're not going to delve into post-electoral violence. The election of Nana Akufo-Addo is solid. Ghana remains in democracy. Burkina Faso with Marc Kabore, Christian Kabore, another example of democracy taking root. South Africa, after years of Jacob Zuma, now has Cyril Ramaphosa, a successful democratic leader, and even the Democratic Republic of Congo, where Felix Tshisekedi had been menacing breaking with Joseph Kabila, stepped back, and peace and democracy seem to be reigning.
Before we leave you, Douglas, any geopolitical predictions for 2021?
Well, I think the important future in the Sahel will be the continued war on terror. And we should expect, with more multilateral cooperation, perhaps things to be improving. I wouldn't be surprised to see Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb take several serious losses, and we should expect France to remain committed with Operation Barkhane in Mali.
Douglas Yates, political scientist and professor at the American Graduate School in Paris, thank you very much for your time. And thank you for joining us on this special edition of Eye on Africa. Tomorrow, we will be looking back at the good news, the feel-good stories from this past year, how the continent rose to the occasion when it came to dealing with COVID-19, a major health milestone for Africa. And we'll hear from our DRC correspondent, Clément Bonnereau, who will share his experience covering a heartwarming story. Join us tomorrow at 8:45 and 9:45 p.m. GMT.